Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first adventure in the flipped classroom world. Today marks the start of a brand new unit, and we are going to kick that off with a talk about the Silk Road. So Unit 2 and Unit 1 kind of go hand in hand. So some of the stuff that we are supposed to talk about, we might not talk about because we talked about it last time. So we are just going to dive right into it. Unit 1 was looking at the different civilizations, the different expanding of empires, and then this unit, Unit 2, looks at just how interconnected everybody becomes to be during the Middle Age time period. And one of the significant ways that we become interconnected, the world, I should say, becomes interconnected is through trade. And one of the most infamous trade routes is obviously the Silk Road. So let's get at it. Let's do it. So the Silk Road, as many of you know, I hope at least, was just a trade system. It initially began in about the 3rd century BCE under the Han Dynasty, and then it lasted until the 18th century. So if you're into the whole numbers thing, the 18th century is the 1700s. And the reason why we call the Silk Road is because it traded one of the most lucrative products during this time, which was silk, and it was carried throughout its length. The Silk Road actually started as a series of just minor trade routes, and then later it was converted into this major trade route as roads began to be built, and it became one of the most significant roads as it expanded into Central Asia and then on into Europe and on into Africa, as you see in the picture below. So one of the other significant factors about the Silk Road is that it was one of the reasons why the Great Wall of China was expanded into the territory, and that was to protect the trade route from outside invasions. Now in the picture that you see below, you see the Eurasian trade route, you see the Indian Ocean, you see the Silk Road, Mediterranean, and then the Trans-Saharan. All of those play a significant part in expanding belief systems, kickstarting globalization, as we will talk about. And these are all different roads or different trade routes that we will talk about in this unit. So let's dive a little deeper here. So as trade was growing, you also see the growth of trading cities in ports. So large trading cities had communities that featured foreign merchants. They also exchanged foreign goods. Cities like Malacca were very orderly, strategically located, and had reasonable custom fees because you had import-export fees even at this point in time as well. So cities are gaining money from being around these trade routes. The kind of downfall of these long distance trade routes is that you do see the increase of nomadic invasions. You do see, expansion of territories to try to control these trade routes. And then you see the need for protection of trade routes. This is one of the reasons why we see trade routes moving from land to sea, because you could cut out the middlemen in all of this, because through each empire, through each territory, you had to pay a customs fee. But if you were traveling by sea, you didn't necessarily have to have that customs fee, and you could go directly to the traders. So there was a lot of issues with the Silk Road and with land-based trade routes. And then eventually we'll talk about the Indian Ocean, but there was also, we see these issues with land-based move to the sea-based trade routes as well. So some of the items that were traded along this route were luxury goods, and it became the main source of income for people who lived along the Silk Road. So you had items like silk and cotton textiles, you had gold, silver, and gems, porcelain, spices, all kinds of things that were seen as being exotic items. So items that you couldn't necessarily get anywhere else in the world. And one of the most precious commodities was, we talked about this, spices and salt to help preserve meat. And when it starts to go bad, make it taste better. A trade was also helping to encourage significant innovations. Much of those include around sea, around sailing. So you have the compass and astrolabe. You have larger ship designs that could hold more products. And then you also start to see new forms of credit. So you start to see house banks, or bank houses, as they were called. And these were basically institutions that you could give your money and they would hold on to it. And then you could also open up lines of credit. So you could open up credit in Egypt and be able to use that credit even in China. You also see the caravanserai. Excuse me. And then the use of saddles. The caravanserais are basically just little inns that have open courtyards where merchants would stay. And the open courtyards, they would be able to, see who's coming. They would be able to, protect the goods that they were selling or taking back home. And saddles also became important because if you were going overland, it means you were riding for long periods of day. So you needed to be a little bit more comfortable. So these actually made it easier for people to trade. And then, of course, you have the adventures of Marco Polo. So Marco Polo was a Venetian merchant who traveled through Asia and documented his experiences. He traveled with his merchant father and uncle. He, was able to go to the Mongol court of Kublai Khan in China, and then he went back to Venice after 17 years just traveling throughout all of China. And his narratives of his travels would become a best-selling book, and it would inspire Europeans to also become merchants. Because if you look at that time period that Marco Polo did his traveling, you also see that that's kind of the end of the Middle Ages or Dark Ages in Europe and the rise of the Renaissance. So this belief that, we can be one world, so to speak. The rebirth of knowledge. You also have Ibn Battuta. He was a Berber Muslim, so northern Africa. He was an explorer, and he actually would journey the furthest out of any person before him. He journeyed more than 75,000 miles. And that would only be surpassed once the steamboat was invented. He traveled to more than 44 different modern countries. His traveling lasted for almost 30 years. And like Marco Polo, Battuta actually wrote down his experiences and his accounts of what the world was like in the 14th century in a book called the Rila. And as a part of this book, he details his experiences of being able to sit in as a legal scholar for Sharia law wherever he went. So he was a highly regarded traveler and explorer. He wasn't a merchant, he was just out exploring the world, and he documented it just like Marco Polo did. And I can tell you that there are a few accounts that are quite interesting and a little bit contrasting between what Marco Polo saw and what Battuta saw. And that's a whole different conversation. So because trade was increasing and you had the involvement of so many different countries, so many different empires, so many different territories, you had to have good diplomatic relations. So it required diplomatic relations to work. And many of the leaders did actually try to work together to keep it going. For instance, Pope Innocent IV invited the Mongols to convert to Christianity. Now, of course, the Mongols are like, ha! Their counteroffer was Christians accept Mongol rule or face destruction. That sounds more like the Mongols. It's a little naive and also a little narcissistic. Hey, convert to Christianity and we'll be besties, right? Why can't we just be besties regardless? Now, very much like today, trade wars can seriously damage economies, and trade wars did happen all the time. This is one of the reasons why we had a push in Europe for sea-based exploration and trade to cut out all of that excess, money and customs tax that you saw along these land-based trade routes. So it was very important that people worked together, or else it could come crumbling apart. Perfect example of that is the Crusades, or prior to the Crusades, when you had all of these people vying for one specific land or reclaiming lands, and everything just falls apart like it does, right? You also saw the growth and expansion of religion. So we looked at the Islamic caliphates and the spread of religion in northern Africa along those trans-Saharan trade routes. You had Sufi Muslims who were missionaries that visited, conquered or converted lands, as well as Christian missionaries who accompanied crusaders. Catholic priests would often travel into the East to serve expatriate communities. And then you also saw, or you can also see, that John Montecorvino went on missions to convert the Mongols. You even see in some cases where Christians went into northern Africa to convert Muslims and end up converting to Islam themselves. There's a great story I need to tell you guys about the first pirates. The first pirates were not in the Caribbean, they were actually in the Mediterranean. It's kind of interesting story. So then you see this cross-cultural interaction start to happen. Goods were not the only thing exchanged along these trade routes. You had new technology. So gunpowder developed in China began to be spread by the Mongol armies in the 13th century. They're the ones that made, the catapults and the very primitive forms of cannons. You also saw new crops that were introduced to sub-Saharan Africa by Muslims, like citrus fruits. You also have the champa rice, and you have cotton. And then later on, you would see sugarcane that originated in Southwest Asia and North Africa. Those would be introduced, like the crystallized sugar would be introduced to crusaders, and then Europeans would follow the Muslims' precedent of using slave labor on plantations, Muslim captives, and then, of course, Africans, as we spoke about before. And then right smack dab at the beginning of the 14th century, the 1300s, global temperatures start to rapidly decline. And we call this period the Little Ice Age because for the next 500 years, temperatures would be so cold that farming declined, which created a widespread famine, which resulted in millions of deaths. That also meant that millions were weak because they didn't have food, and they themselves faced death. And then you have the plague. So in the mid-14th to the 15th century, Afro-Eurasia, so Africa, Europe, and Asia, experienced the most deadly disease outbreak in the history of the world. It was known as the Black Death, or the plague. And it killed hundreds of millions of people globally, not just in Europe, globally. And a major effect of this is that society subsequently became more violent as the mass mortality rate cheapened life. You saw an increase of warfare, crime, you saw revolts, waves of flagellance, and also persecution. And this disease, as we know, originated in Central Asia. It was spread throughout the Silk Road by Mongols. And it was also spread when started to explore. First ships bringing over goods. Womp womp. Now, at the beginning of all of this, nobody exactly knew what the causes of the plague were. Medieval doctors didn't have any idea. Medieval doctors were pretty much useless. They thought the plague was, because of the movements of the planets, or that it was a punishment for God. It was, the bad smells and the corrupt air. People were poisoning wells. It was just wearing pointy shoes is probably my favorite one out of all of this. Along with strangers were, let into villages, and they were the ones to blame for all of this. Because humans, we, like each other. But what we now know today is that scientists believe the Black Plague was caused by a type of bacteria that was carried by a flea. Fleas on rats, and then those fleas would jump from the rats into humans, and that's where we get the spread of the plague. Now, there are 3 different versions of the plague. So you have the bubonic plague, which killed about 50% of the people who contracted it. You had the pneumonic plague, which killed about 90% of the people who had it. And then you have what's called septicemic plague, which attacks your heart and your vascular system, and that pretty much killed 100% of the people that got it. Now, at the beginning of the Black Death or the plague, it was bubonic, which meant that the only way that you could, get it is if there was like fluid to fluid contact. Like if there was a cut on your hand and you touched somebody who had it. Now, what was scary is that the disease, mutated and became what's called pneumonic, which meant that it was in the water droplets that we all, that exit our body as we are talking or coughing, which meant it was airborne. So once it became airborne, that was it. If you were in the room, you could catch it. Not unlike, what many think COVID is like today. And it would take about 3 to 7 days to fully kill you. Yeah, like that's not a very long time to even try to rebound from it. So symptoms were fever, painful swelling of the lymph nodes, there were red spots on the skin that would eventually turn black, and then your armpits would fill with blood. Oh yeah, it's a great disease, right? These are pictures of what it looks like in the modern day. Now, yes, for those of you who didn't know, the Black Plague is still very much around to this day, and it always pops up with a few cases. But the thing is that we now know what causes it, and we can treat it with antibiotics, if it is caught in time. By the end of 1349, the disease had spread to Italy, and shortly thereafter, it just rapidly spread throughout the rest of Europe. I want to hear what's interesting to you all, what you notice, what stands out about the spread of this disease to you guys. Because I know there are a few things to me. We'll talk about it in class.